welcome to the first in our Science and Society webinar and discussion series. It's so great to have so many of you here. I am Brooke Smith, the Director of Public Engagement with Science at the Kavli Foundation, and we are so happy to kick off this series with our first discussion on diversity, equity, inclusion, and public engagement with science, connections between research and practice. I just wanted to say a few words about why we're doing this, this webinar series, what we hope to expect. You are being joined right now by peers and colleagues from Kavli Institutes around the world and folks that are connected with Kavli Institutes. I guess it was about 2 years ago, I had the pleasure of talking in a formal interview process with many of you at the Institutes about what you're doing in public engagement, what you aspire to do in engaging the public in science. And I heard a couple really exciting things from you all. One being that you were really interested in connecting with other institutes and learning what they're doing in this area, but also recognizing that Kavli is connected to experts and other practitioners who are leading really exciting programs in engaging the public in science, and hoping you might connect with them to learn more about some of the best practices or scholarship that's happening. So we've designed this webinar series. We'll meet every month or so, 4 to 6 weeks is what we aspire to do on a different topic. This is a topic I heard from many of you that you were interested in. How public engagement can help you achieve your diversity goals, how you can think about diversity and inclusion in your public engagement. And so that's why we started on this topic, and we will get feedback from you all to hear about what else you'd like to hear about and talk about. We are doing a webinar style today because so many of you were interested in joining, but we will be looking for other ways to do discussion and be looking for your feedback about that. We are really excited about this. As you all know, the Kavli Foundation's mission, advancing science for the benefit of humanity, is focused on, of course, supporting the great science that you all do, but also recognizing that science is part of humanity and thinking about the connections between various publics, your communities, various audiences, is really becoming central to how many of you are thinking about your work. And so if we can be a resource to provide connections to each other and to experts, we would love to do that. So the next slide, thanks, Melina. I wanted to acknowledge in your registration, there's a link to what our convening principles and practices are. And just want to acknowledge that we have these and we really value them. And they're grounded in respect and humility and listening to the various colleagues that you have here and to those who are up on the screen. If you want to go and see more details about that, you can click on the link. And if you want to share any concerns, there's a mechanism for you to do that with Foundation staff. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jeanne Garbarino. We are really fortunate to have Jeannie help us. So Jeannie, we've enlisted Jeannie to help us with this webinar series. So she'll be helping design the different discussions and facilitate and lead them. Jeannie is at Rockefeller, where she is part of the Rock EDU team. So she works with the Kavli Institute at Rockefeller and others at Rockefeller in achieving their engagement and outreach goals. Jeannie herself is, I'm so excited about having her do this with us because she is a leader, a national leader and an international leader in science engagement and outreach. So she's really connected to the broader network and field thinking about it. So we're leaning heavily on her to bring her connection to the practice that happens every day on campus and with institutes, with her knowledge of what's happening with the field to help design and facilitate what will be the most meaningful discussions for this group. So I am going to pop off screen and enjoy listening to this great discussion and turn it over to Jeannie, who will run us through. Good morning, Jeannie, and thank you so much for being here.
Good morning, Brooke. Thank you so much for having me and for this fantastic introduction. As Brooke mentioned, my name is Jeanne Garbarino, and it is my pleasure to be the moderator for what will undoubtedly be a fantastic discussion. For over a decade, I have been leading Rock EDU Science Outreach at the Rockefeller University, which is also home to the Kavli Neural Systems Institute, and have seen firsthand what is possible when a scientific community embraces engagement and acknowledges the value of creating inclusive environments for trainees and scientists at all levels. Through this series, I hope I will be able, with the panelists and others at Kavli, hope to be able to shine a light on the complexities of engagement work and help build community and practical resources for any and all Kavli scientists who wish to be a part of this movement. But before we jump in, I just want to provide a few housekeeping notes. First, please note that this session is being recorded. You will be able to access this recording on the Kavli website in the near future, should you wish to revisit some of the discussion. Second, despite the challenges of Zoom webinar formats, we want to hear from you. I will do my best to set up our conversation to spark questions and curiosities, which will be easy given the wonderful and smart perspectives of our panelists, I will introduce shortly. Please feel free to use the question box, and we will do our best to address as many questions from you as possible. If you're having technical difficulties, please use the chat function to message host and panelists. Additionally, as this is our very first Science and Society webinar series, we would absolutely love any feedback about your experience as an audience member. We want to serve our communities to the best of our abilities, and we can only iterate as a means to improve if you let us know what is working and what isn't. As such, please be on the lookout for our post-webinar survey, which will be shared in the chat box at the end of the discussion. Okay, let's get to our panelists. I'm thrilled to be here with three excellent voices in the science engagement space. Rick Crouse, who is a postdoc at Yale University and the leader of the student and postdoc-run organization Science Haven. We also have Matthew Bothwell, who has an absolute gem role as a public astronomer with the Institute of Astronomy at Cambridge University. And last but not least, Angela Calabrese Barton, who is a professor at the Learning Sciences and Science Education Group at the University of Michigan. To keep on time, I will hand it over to each panelist to provide a 2-minute introduction to their work. So we'll start with Rick. Rick, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Jeannie. I'm really excited to be here today and to talk to you all about some of the work I've done with Science Haven. So Science Haven is a collaboration between multiple graduate student groups that aims to partner with community leaders to bring hands-on science activities to neighborhood events. And I want to start with the punchline here and emphasize why I'm so proud of the work that Science Haven does. Instead of making people come onto campus for STEM programming, Science Haven meets people where they are, of course, during non-COVID times. We have relationships with neighborhoods such that we're invited to be part of their fall festivals, back to school block parties, movies in the park, and a ton more. You might think to yourself though, but so much of my cool stuff is on campus. And you're right that we can't really lug around a confocal microscope, but the benefit is this. Science Haven gets grad students to approach science engagement by being a neighbor first and a scientist second. And the reason why we take this approach is because not everyone feels comfortable on Yale's campus or feels like STEM-focused events are for them. This can be especially true for students and families from backgrounds that are historically underrepresented in STEM, and when there are tensions between institutions and the cities they're a part of. Science Haven was what's called a Digging Deeper project, funded by Science in Vivo, meaning we already had a ton of experience creating and refining science demonstrations, giving engaging lectures to students, basically all the stuff that you either do already or are familiar with, but we knew we could do better. So we worked really hard to lower the activation energy for families to engage with STEM. This did not happen overnight, and I'm happy to go into more details later, but it led to forming connections with neighbors and being a fixture at neighborhood events, right between the face painting and the free books table. So we had a ton of fun with families checking out Oobleck and robotic claws right in their backyards, but the result is a lot more than that. Through this approach, researchers are becoming more interwoven into the broader New Haven community in an organic way and are being seen as trusted neighbors that also happen to be scientists. I'm excited to talk to you all about it more, and thank you very much again.
Thank you so much, Rick. It's been a pleasure watching Science Haven do its thing. I have bared witness to an event with Rick, so it was fantastic. Matt, it would be wonderful if we can hear a little bit about you.
Hi everyone. Yes, morning, afternoon, wherever you are. Really great to be here. Thank you so much for the invite. I'm excited to talk about all the cool work that we're doing in Cambridge. Just to introduce me, my job is being the public astronomer here at Cambridge University. So I have a kind of dual role. I wear two hats. So it's my job to oversee the outreach program that we have here in the department, which involves doing stuff like working with other academics to improve their science communication skills and overseeing all of the astronomy outreach activities we do. But I'm also an ex-academic or an ex-researcher, and so I do deliver a lot of the outreach stuff myself. So I'm responsible for talking to the public and helping other scientists be better at talking to the public. Yes, I'm sure we'll get into some of the things that we actually do. I think Our flagship outreach program, which is funded by the Kavli Foundation, is what we call Astro East. And that's a program to use astronomy as a vehicle for increasing science literacy and social mobility across one of the most deprived areas of the UK. Here in Cambridge, we are in a bit of a privileged bubble, but right on our doorstep across the east of England are some of the areas of greatest deprivation in terms of education skills and training. And so what we're trying to do as an institution, and with the help of the Kavli Foundation, is use science outreach and specifically astronomy outreach as a vehicle for increasing aspiration and increasing attainment in these areas.
Fantastic. Thank you for that introduction. Angela, it would be great to hear about you.
Well, good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. I wear lots of different hats, but one of the hats that I wear that I'll be really speaking from today is that I co-led the Center for Advancing Informal Science Education's National Task Force on broadening participation in STEM through informal science education and science communication. And our task force developed a report, a critical framework, and a set of supporting tools to foster dialogue and new practices towards broadening participation in equitable ways. And so I'm going to be talking from the standpoint of the work that we did on this task force. And one of the things I want to say quickly right now is how we framed this problem space. So there's widespread agreement about the urgent need to broaden the diversity of people who participate in, contribute to, and benefit from STEM. But for too long, non-dominant populations in the US and globally have been dramatically underrepresented in STEM academics, professions, and civic decision-making. What we point out is that this indicates a system level failure to recognize, nurture, and channel all young people's early interests in STEM into longer term pursuits and to adopt inclusive approaches for adults participating in STEM or learning experiences. I mean, I think we all know that decades of research demonstrates that engaging with STEM outside of school can play a huge role in sparking interest and in sustaining people's interests in their readiness for and their commitment to academic, professional, and lifelong engagement in STEM. And so the question that we need to tackle today is, as systemic efforts to broaden participation get underway in communities across the country, what role does or can the field of SciComm play to ensure its success? So what I want to do quickly is to share with you a quote from Jasmine, a 14-year-old, that she shared with us in reflecting on her experiences in the pandemic, because I think it really crystallizes the essence of the issues that we're dealing with. She says, "The racist stereotype is that Black people are not listening to science, but that is not true. Maybe it's the other way around, like science is not listening to us. I just wish that people could see what I could do, like what I'm doing at home, making homemade hand sanitizer, making masks, caring for my elders. I don't want to act white. I don't want people to tell me I'm not white enough. I want you to know how I feel as a young Black girl in America and in STEM. I want to feel like I can be me in STEM and have that celebrated." And so Jasmine's calling us to recognize her for who she is, a bright, caring Black girl interested in STEM, but she's also critiquing a system that's made her invisible despite her embodied presence. Jasmine's comment speaks to why it's important to focus on justice-oriented frames for inclusive SciComm. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much. I think, Angela, we'll start with, we'll sort of use that as a jumping off point. And this quote from Jasmine is one that I hear often in the work that we're doing of, I once was asking young women with a Muslim background what they thought about a specific science event, and they said, "Why would you ask me? You don't even care what I want to, you don't care what I have to say." And that was an eye opener for me in terms of how we do our engagement work at Rocky to You and how we need to do better to not instill trust in others, but to showcase that we are in fact trustworthy and worth their time. And so with that, I want to start off by asking you, Angie, some of the work that you've put out in this report, and we see that many scientists are motivated to participate in science engagement, specifically as a means of meeting diversity, equity, and inclusion criteria. Yet, given your work, it seems that there is a really large disconnect. What can you tell us about the data around the effectiveness of the work that scientists are doing in engagement with many publics, and what we might want to think about moving forward?
Yeah, definitely. I'm really happy to share with you some of the research. And I really just want to call our attention to this fact that, inequities in STEM participation have persisted for decades, for centuries, for individuals from non-dominant communities, leading to, limited access and opportunity to pursue STEM, whether it's a STEM profession or just a STEM agentic life. And as I mentioned, this needs to be viewed as a system level failure. And so when we think about the efforts that are out there and what we know from research, I think there are a couple things we need to think about. One, we have to think about just the nature of programs that exist and who they're reaching, and what this means for opportunities to learn. And so one of the points that I want to call your attention to is that, research shows us that the dominant views on broadening participation across programs that are out there are fairly limited in terms of who and what they reach. So generally defined as, we're going to increase participation of people from, historically underrepresented communities in support of, providing access and opportunity to engage in STEM. But access and opportunity in of themselves are not enough. So for example, research shows us that increasing opportunities often equates to increasing the number of programs that have proven effective for dominant culture populations, but that's not for everyone, right? Access only participation approaches places the burden of participation on people from non-dominant communities, does not place the burden for participation on the system. Also suggests that lack of participation is not due to the nature of the STEM engagement programs themselves, but rather to individuals' lack of awareness, transportation, funds, and so on. These are all deficit-oriented frames to thinking about what it means to broaden participation in STEM. But research also shows us that families do not experience out-of-school enrichment equally. The richest fifth of the US families spend over 7 times more on their children's out-of-school time than the poorest fifth, and most public engagement opportunities serve a fairly wide audience. And so I think there are 4 kind of big themes that we ought to be looking at. First, why do people choose to engage in STEM? So SciComm has operated from pipeline and pathway metaphor. So, how do we connect people to STEM opportunities? As I was mentioning, access and opportunity. How do we ensure that we stay there? But these approaches tend to adopt normative models of what STEM professional and practices look like, the same models that are historically associated with the exclusion of non-dominant communities from STEM. So the field also needs to consider conceptualizing participation as personal and community agency, rather than bringing people to STEM. As Rick was mentioning, think about bringing and integrating STEM into where people are in their daily concerns, their interests, and their activities. So for example, you can think about in your own programs, what are the goals of your science communication activities? What outcomes do you seek in terms of changing participation and how participants think, understand, or act? Another theme I think we can think about is, how are people asked to engage with STEM? Most audiences for public engagement with STEM in the US are white, college educated, and middle class. And so the means of participating, the ways of speaking, working, and acting in these experiences tend to reflect these cultures. And we can think about this as the dominant cultural norms for engaging in STEM and how these norms typify white, middle class, educated, and male culture. And so broadening participation requires redesigning public engagement to legitimately value people in their cultural experiences. Another area to think about is, when do critical approaches to broadening participation need to happen? Here I'm asking is whether broadening participation in public engagement efforts sit as a priority or the periphery of an organization. Research shows that these efforts tend to be one-off and they sit at periphery of organizations. So what would it take for this to become the mainstay of an organization? So if an organization or program wasn't founded on the principles of diversity, equity, inclusion, then how can you realign, your program design and also get staff to think about whether and how the work should be oriented to more justice-oriented frames for public engagement? How can you think about your approach to equity as focusing not on repairing individuals, but repairing the system? And lastly, another theme in the research is, where do critical approaches to broadening participation in public engagement need to happen? And so here, the research is very clear. There needs to be a STEM ecosystem in support of these efforts. So think about a coordinated and comprehensive effort to create a seamless system of support. I think we can all agree a lack of coordination leads to missed opportunities. So public engagement with STEM could have stronger impacts for the public if there's intentional connection with and reinforcement of the experiences that are out there. And so, what makes ecosystems so powerful is that learning itself is a social process, and it's through social networks, social interactions that people can develop and refine and grow the tools, resources, and motivations for learning and engaging in STEM across a life span.
Thank you. I think this is a really good jumping off point for me to sort of segue into some of what Rick has been done. And we're hearing from you, Angela, decentralization of the academic institution is really important. Putting a higher value on science engagement. It's not valuing science above all else, it's science. And we're also hearing this sort of relationship building, right? And this is something I think Rick has done really well. Rick, you have a lot of experience building community relationships, particularly with the Dwight community of New Haven, Connecticut, which is a predominantly Black neighborhood. Can you describe how you learned from your failures as a means to close the gaps and build a healthy, trustworthy rapport with Dwight community members?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I mentioned earlier, this definitely didn't happen overnight. So last night, actually, I was going through my emails to find when the first time I made contact with Dwight was, and it was early in 2018. But it's been a slow process of showing that I was legit, basically, that I wasn't just there to extract some sort of value, which is something that I'll talk about later. But how I learned from failures was really just, I think, keeping a couple of things central in mind, that I had to be consistent, I needed to be humble, and I had to be flexible. And to learn from failures, you really have to put in effort. It's just not going to happen, just by chance when you watch something crash and burn. So I'll start with two failures that happened really early on and talk about what I learned from those, and hopefully there'll be some nuggets of wisdom in there. So I lived in Dwight ever since I moved to New Haven in 2015 for grad school. I was active in science communication and outreach engagement from the beginning. But as I learned more about New Haven, my colleagues and I realized that the groups that we were a part of could do a much better job at interacting with local students and families. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip a lot of it about how we got more connected within Yale to focus on the parts relevant to neighborhood science. And so we learned that New Haven neighborhoods have what's called a community management team. And so this is a group of neighbors that get together monthly to talk about what's going on in their area. So they advocate for improvements, they host local events for families, they hear things like zoning issues, all kinds of stuff like that. And at these meetings, you can request to give a quick announcement or update. And I started with my neighborhood, Dwight, because I lived literally a block away from where they met. And I was at the meeting, I signed in, I listened to discussion about the local parks and the events coming up, and then it came time for announcements. And with all public speaking, I was extremely nervous, and this is where my first failure was. I completely bombed. I remember this very, very clearly. I spoke way too fast, I mumbled, and I wasn't very clear. And I could see it in the faces of people in the crowd. They had no idea what I just said. It all came out as a blur. And I knew I blew it. But the words science and STEM somehow got across, and I got really lucky because the chair of this management team actually majored in biology. And she told me later that she liked science, but she realized that she couldn't work in a lab all day, but she wanted to get science events in front of the kids in her neighborhood. And so she asked me right on the spot while I was standing up there, like just sweating buckets, basically, if I would be at their spring festival and the movie in the park. And I said I'd be there. And so I learned from that failure that I needed to relax and play to my strengths. I was there to talk to my neighbors about some cool events that we wanted to do at our next event. I didn't have to be the most eloquent, even though it would have been better if I was. But what I had to do was to be earnest and consistent. And I was initially met with a lot of skepticism by people there because they thought I was going to be just another one of these Yale students that pops in for a minute and then dips out after the first event. But I showed over and over that I'm here to stay and that I care about the neighborhood. And this, again, happened over time. And throughout the years, I really feel like I've become part of the family. They know they can turn to me if they need an extra hand for anything, whether that's a science event or a neighborhood cleanup. And they show up to support me as well. Several of these women were at my thesis defense, and they're people I consider real friends. So it's just it doesn't always work the way you want. And this is brings me to the second failure, and that involves an inflatable planetarium, which was a disaster. No one was hurt, thankfully, so it wasn't that kind of disaster. But in terms of the content and learning goals, it was terrible. We did the spring festival, and then a week later, we were doing this movie in the park, which was hosted by the Parks and Recreation Department of New Haven. So they bring an inflatable screen, and they were showing Hidden Figures, which was just so perfect. We're like, wow, this is really awesome. We're going to do some astronomy, like galaxy physics stuff. And I heard that there was a group on campus that was away for the summer because it was an undergraduate group, and we could borrow their inflatable planetarium with the projector. And we were getting some astronomy grad students to come in and talk about the stars. It was going to be perfect. But the kids could not care less about this projector that we like painstakingly set up angled just right so they could see the stars. They just wanted to have a good time in this like basically bouncy house. So what I learned from this was you can't take yourself or your demos too seriously when it comes to being in someone else's backyard. And this is pretty hard sometimes whenever you have to pull strings to get a permit and insurance coverage last minute for the event when you find that out like the day of. But some things these work out because everyone has a great time. And I heard at subsequent management team meetings that families were telling the chair of the management team that they really loved it. They're super awesome, and they want to know when we're going to be at their next event. So just to recap, just don't take yourself too seriously or these demos too seriously. Be flexible and just relax and play to your strengths. If you're really good at these smaller group interactions with demos, then think about how you can best utilize that for working with neighbors and making sure that you're putting partnerships first. Ask them what they want to do. Don't just say, I'm going to do this thing.
Thanks. I think you hit on two really key points when it comes to doing engagement effectively, especially when you may not be a member of the community that you're looking to serve, which is something that happens to me all the time. I am a white woman. I serve New York City school system, which is 70% underrepresented minoritized groups. It's not easy to sort of be the white woman in the room. Well, let me back up because that's not what I meant to say. But I'm saying to connect with our students, they are very skeptical of me, right? And I have to break down those barriers. And you hit, Rick, on this idea of being your authentic self, which I think is absolutely key. And another thing you hit on is agility. You may have an amazingly planned out operation ready to go with every piece, completely streamlined, only to need to throw it out so that you can actually make the connection with your community and the audiences you hope to serve. Thank you for showcasing those points. And given that you've talked about astronomy, perhaps this would be a really nice segue to talk a little bit more with Matt. Matt, we've heard Rick's experience as a graduate student, and he's done a really nice job at mobilizing his trainee community, so fellow graduate students and postdocs, to participate in these events that they've been hosting with the Dwight community. How does this differ for faculty and other members of academia? Where do you see both the strengths and gaps for engagement efforts as they relate to diversity, equity, and inclusion work out of academic institutions?
Well, I think an important thing to realize is that it's going to vary hugely between institutions, and it's going to depend very strongly on the culture and the attitude towards public engagement that exists within the department. I think one of the strengths of my home department here in Cambridge is that we have this well-established public engagement program, which acts to lowers the barrier to entry for any researchers that want to get involved. It's obviously a much easier sell for academics if you can approach them with specific, well-defined opportunities to engage with the public. So, for example, here in Cambridge, along with our Astro East program I spoke about before, we engage with lots of local schools all over Cambridge. We have a regular series of public lectures. We have community groups coming to us to learn about stargazing and learn about the night sky. And when academics arrive in the department for the first time, particularly the incoming cohort of grad students, we are able to say, these are our existing public engagement activities, and this is what you can do to get involved. It's all about lowering that barrier to entry. And I think that way, if you make it very easy to participate, you can take someone who might have had maybe some vague interest in public engagement, which I think is the majority of academics. I think it's very rare to come across an academic who just says straight up, I don't care about this whatsoever, right? I think the majority of academics have some vague interest in public engagement, and but they might not have necessarily put that into practice. And I think what I try and do here in Cambridge is just lower that barrier to entry as much as possible to take that vague interest and help them take that first step. I think the downside of this approach of kind of laying out the menu of activities that the department does is that the list of opportunities can end up feeling a bit prescribed, maybe. And while it makes it easy to participate, it maybe makes people a bit less likely to be creative and innovative when coming up with interesting new ways to engage the public. So it's important to strike that balance, right? To have easy opportunities, but then also let people spread their wings and be a bit creative once they feel a bit more comfortable.
Yeah, I fully relate to this. I think, in working with my community at Rockefeller, a lot of people are focused on their research, but they want to be involved. And it's hard to keep up on the sort of literature and best practices that's consistently evolving in these spaces. And so this is why I'm a big proponent of centralized engagement or outreach offices out of institutions. Let us, the experts, or with the people with the expertise, create the frameworks so that the scientists can insert themselves and learn along the way. This is not, I think one of the disconnects also is that scientists are not just doing a service, they are actually learning. They're learning about their communities. They're learning about how to, speak and write and communicate in ways that are not just to their peers, but to the many publics that are out there. And it's a transferable skill set. So what do you think about this idea? And this would be to everybody, that, people consider this work as more service oriented and not necessarily as skills building. And maybe this could be a way to help close those gaps.
Yeah, I think I'm already off mute, so I guess I'll jump
yeah.
in. So I think it's really, really important to stress to researchers that public engagement work is not separate from your development as an academic, right? A lot of the skills that you hone as a public engagement person are directly applicable to being a better researcher and a better academic. Being able to communicate your science effectively is going to help anyone. One of the things I always tell the incoming PhD students, we run communication workshops here for graduate students. One of the things I always stress for them is that if you're giving a job talk, for example, you're going to have to communicate your science to people far outside your academic niche. And so I think it's really, really important not to frame outreach and public engagement as a kind of charitable side gig that doesn't affect your academic work, right? It's all part of a single, unified, cohesive skill set that will make you a better researcher and a better scientist, as well as being an important service for society.
Angela, have you seen any sort of evidence of, and this is out of curiosity, has there been any work to compare people who are sort of doing their own ad hoc stuff versus those who are doing it with people in the engagement profession in terms of the effectiveness of the work?
I'm not actually familiar with research along those lines. I think that would be really interesting. I think that there's a couple of really big questions here that I think are being surfaced, especially in Rick and Matthew's comments. So one is this idea of I'll say sustained engagement and co-design. You know, whose voice is at the table when we think about designing experiences around public engagement? Because that's going to have a really big impact in terms of whose perspectives, you know, are centered, what that means for the nature of experience, how outcomes of experiences get operationalized in practice. And so, you know, I hear, for example, a lot of the work described by Rick is a practice of co-design. How do we sit at the table with our community members we're working with to ensure that their perspectives, their needs, their ideas are valued, are integral to the nature of this public engagement? We have to think about this kind of work as being a bidirectional or multidirectional. It cannot be, you know, in a singular direction. It cannot be science to people, because that reinforces a kind of power hierarchy that we know works against our efforts to really broaden participation. And then I think another theme that I'm hearing is, I like to use this metaphor of, it's kind of the house metaphor: low floors, high ceilings, lots of hallways, right? So we want to think about experiences that create many different kinds of, you know, ways for people to get into that experience, and many different pathways that they can take through that experience towards, you know, outcomes that work for them. And so, you know, as we think about the design of public engagement experiences, we got to think about the role of co-design, and we got to think about kind of that flexibility and creativity towards kind of the low floor, high ceiling approach.
Mm-hmm.
That makes a lot of sense with the co-design, and I appreciate you bringing that up, Angela, because, and I want to do stress, I do want to stress, when I was thinking about co-design, if you really take a second to think about bringing events to neighborhood, bringing activities to neighborhood events, it may seem like, oh, maybe I should talk to what these constituents want, but it's important to sort of temper your expectations for the bandwidth that people have to help you co-design. If you come to them with like a huge proposal, it's like 3 pages of like, all right, so here's the thing that we can do for organic chemistry, here's electrophysiology, it's gonna overwhelm them. And so sometimes you're just gonna need to be really nimble, like we talked about before, and flexible. If someone tells you that they're showing hidden figures at their event, ask them, you know, would you like to have some sort of related events? Like we had a physics demonstration in the planetarium, or the planetarium. So, you know, sometimes that's a level where it's easy to meet people where they don't have to do more work. But sometimes people want to be really engaged and help you workshop these talks and do a lot of things. But you just need to be really respectful of people's time as well when you're thinking about co-design, because it's incredibly important, but it can be another burden on people to where they sort of, you know, want you to, they want to push back, and they don't want to do that, basically.
So I think this is a perfect time to bring in a question from our audience. And we have one from Lomax. Hello, Lomax at Rockefeller. What efforts are being made to better understand the values of the communities being served, and providing those insights back to researchers and public engagement professionals for future program development? So how are we figuring out what people want out of these engagement efforts? What are some ways that work?
I guess I want to maybe answer partially from a bit of a place of ignorance, because I have not been as good as engaging with science professionals and academics that study this. But I have gone to a couple of conferences around like national, or like the broader impacts and things like that, to ask, because I was like, I don't know what I'm doing here. And this was spurred from the fact that when I went to one of these management teams, so not the Dwight one, but a different neighborhood in New Haven, I gave my pitch, and I'd gotten a little better at providing it. And I brought one of the demos with us too, to play, you know, to show the families afterwards. But a woman raised her hand and asked, she's like, so are you trying to get data from us? Are you trying to survey us? And that was a really interesting insight that I'm glad that she, you know, voiced, because it showed, and, you know, some of the history of people getting exploited by, you know, surveys or academics that are coming in to try to study something. And sometimes, a lot of times, the communities are left with nothing after that. You know, they spend a lot of their time answering these questions, doing pre and post surveys, but it doesn't really yield anything for them necessarily. And so I went to these conferences to try to figure out, like, how do I measure some of the metrics of success that I am trying to do here, but not be intrusive and be respectful. And this is something I grapple with a lot, because, you know, I'll leave an event feeling really good, like, wow, you know, all these kids had a lot of fun, there's all these great pictures, but I feel it feels
very sloppy to me as an academic. Like that's never how I do an experiment. I would be horrified if at the end of an experiment I had no data, basically. So I just want to underscore the fact that it's sometimes really difficult to get this in a way that's conscientious and respectful of everybody's feelings and place.
So I'll just jump in right now to further respond to this question. So there is research out there, both in science education and the learning sciences, which describe participatory design approaches that one could take to try to better learn about the interests, the needs, the experience, the hope for, outcomes in these programs of communities. And so this process of co-design doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has to be sitting at the table doing the same thing, putting the same amount of time into it, right? I think the bigger question with any kind of participatory design approach or trying to understand what communities may want or need or desire is, how do we get to know communities better? What kinds of asset mapping could we do, as program designers to build a strong repertoire of understandings around community needs? What are the ways in which we can design programs themselves that actively solicit for the perspectives and the experience of our participants? So, what is it about the design of programs that is actively engaging the rich lives of our participants? It's not just the science content itself, right? It's about that intersection. So I think some of these insights are written about in the literature. One of the resources that we'll be sharing with you are the toolkit that we created on the Broadening Participation Task Force through CASE, and there are research practice briefs on these topics there that you might find useful.
Thanks. And, I think this idea of co-design and not putting some burden on community members so that you can create a good engagement is a really, really integral point. And I want to just elevate a comment from Luis, who is a postdoc originally from El Salvador. And in the comment, it suggests that this is a troubled country and people have problems much bigger than learning, for example, neuroscience. So what advice would you provide to someone in a position like Luis, in having the privilege of a research space, but is trying to collaborate with people from afar in ways that feel maybe smaller than the problems that they're facing in the moment? And I'm not sure if anybody has an experience on this, but.
I guess maybe I'll just say one quick thing in that I have a lab mate and friend from El Salvador, and he actually expresses a lot of similar feelings. And he's been he did studies in Australia and Europe, and now he's in the States, and he struggles with how to help his country in a way that's actually meaningful. And he takes part in a lot of mentorship opportunities. So this isn't sort of the traditional enriching engagement activities of science, but it does help people who are trying to find their way through STEM in an earlier stage in their career, actually make sure they're getting the opportunities they need. So that could be one way, because I totally get it. People don't want to see a live tweet about or a tweet thread about neuroscience necessarily, or hop on Zoom. But I think that's also it also seems to me that it serves as an opportunity for this participatory design as well, like Angie was talking about. Is there a way to reach out to a community leader from back home that you can say, hey, is there anything way I can support something that you're trying to do in a neighborhood to help train, for instance, high school students that are in El Salvador that like science, that want to do a demo that's a hands-on demo at an event, and you can help workshop the content development, all that stuff. But you don't actually have to be there, but you can still be supporting in a way that's real and impactful.
Yeah, and I believe Brooke has shared the resource of the organization Ciencia PR, which is an amazing organization that certainly has a lot of experience in these spaces. And one experience that I've had is by offering, we were able to connect with countries in South America, students who lived in countries in South America, by promoting Spanish language events. It was in the pandemic, so it was just, over YouTube Live or something like that. And we had our community members here at Rockefeller just get in touch with their home networks and say, hey, I'm going to host this thing. It's going to be in Spanish. We'd love for you to come. It's going to be half an hour long, keeping it really low barrier. And so people can just sort of like listen in. They didn't even need to register. Those are, I think, low barrier for participation, not just for, as Matt said, the faculty or other academics, but also low barrier participation for those communities we hope to serve. So I'd love to hear a little bit from our panelists in thinking about the future. We have a certain reality, but there is a future that we want to see for science, right? And so how do you see engagement with science fitting into the scientific ecosystem as a means to promote DEI work?
Well, at least here in the UK, the science engagement is becoming more and more important every year. I know I'm operating within a very different university system than other people that might be here. But in the UK, we have this REF system, this Research Excellence Framework, which is kind of it's like the financial heartbeat of the university system. And every time the REF rolls around, public engagement activities is given a greater weight in the financial planning of these institutions, which is, it's really nice to have the recognition at the top kind of governmental level that science engagement is increasingly important. And the next one is coming around in 2028, and everything I've been able to tell is that in public engagement again will be more heavily weighted. So from that kind of structural point of view, public engagement is only getting more important, which is wonderful, right? So I think it gets back to this thing I was saying before about not seeing public engagement as this kind of segregated side area. I think more and more, I'm really happy to see that it is being seen as part of the integrated whole of being a scientist.
And I think, Rick, you sort of alluded to this idea previously that engagement work can be very messy, that it wasn't like your controlled experiment. There were these sort of unpredictable data points and factors that shift how you do things sometimes in the moment. And I also want to admit that, even I feel like I've been doing this for over a decade. I mess up all the time. I messed up in here on this webinar just a few minutes ago, right? And it's like, how do you reconcile the messiness of engagement work with sort of the other end of the spectrum of this sort of buttoned up, really rigorous, tight experiments that we're all used to doing in labs and in the field. How do you sort of help scientists be more comfortable with this messiness, I guess, is the question I'm trying to ask.
I see. I think that's a great question. And I think it highlights the fact that I should probably dial back the false dichotomy I drew, because I mean, the first year and a half of my PhD, nothing worked. So my experiments were extremely messy. and I learned a lot from that.
Science is messy. Yes.
Yeah, but I think the way that, I think part of it is getting people in the top, like that are, allotting money, like Matt was talking about, to understand the reality and the nature of what science engagement in the field looks like. And so that's one side, is to sort of make sure that people that are writing the checks for these, or if there are any checks being written, to understand that. But I think probably more importantly for people on this call, or for some people on this call, is to, how do you feel comfortable with it? And I think it's really important just to be really careful and intentional whenever you're thinking about this, because science engagement, very similar to experiments, are iterative. Just like you said, we have to learn, we fail, we get better. But one thing that's really important here is that in the case of community relationships, you're not just at risk of burning a few test tubes or petri dishes, you could potentially burn bridges that are going to wreck relationships for a long time between your institution, even your department, students in general coming and working with this community. So I think just taking into account that you have to put your scientist hat on in this aspect as well of your life, to think about what is it that's not getting through here, and being honest with yourself. Like, you can't just say, oh well, like I did the best I could. Did you really design this in a way that was as collaborative as possible? Did you really listen to the needs and desires and wants of the community? And ask them, how can I do better? And just what can I do to make this better? And just, I think, coming at it from a place of humility and constantly trying to improve. And, if you really want to be out there doing this, then, approach it from that mindset and realize that it is just like, sometimes these pilot experiments that you're not sure what's going to happen, but you see that glimmer of something that's there and you start to, enrich for that and try to figure out what is it that I can do that makes this better and how can I improve upon this.
Thank you. And I want to sort of up a concept that Angela mentioned sort of earlier in this discussion. And it's, this idea of the dominant culture currently dictating the norms of how we operate in scientific ecosystems, and how that's in conflict with appreciating the other sort of ways of knowing that might permeate in other cultures. How Angela, can you talk a little bit about the importance of valuing the multiple ways of knowing and how that's important for engagement work, especially when you are looking to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Sure. So we can think of science itself as being a cultural practice. And so the way that, and it's not homogeneous, but when you look at kind of the dominant norms within science, it is built on a history of whiteness. It's built on a history of heteromasculinity, and so these are the kinds of norms that operate in how we talk about and talk within, argue for, participate in science. And the research out there is just so strong that shows that when these ways of knowing, these ways of talking, these ways of doing are, critically challenged and expanded, then a lot of people are left feeling like outsiders to science. And so, one big question we should be asking ourselves is, what are the ways of knowing, talking, and doing that get valued and prioritized in this space? How can we open that up so that people's experiences and ways of being feel like they matter, in this space of engagement? And so I think that's such a critical issue. There's really powerful work on culturally relevant science teaching and learning, hip hop, STEM, gender inclusive, STEM. And so we can think about the cultural dimensions in a lot of different ways. I think another really interesting piece that ties in here that hasn't come up yet, but I think's kind of been lurking below the surface, and that's the importance of, how do I want to say it, intergenerational learning that takes place in public engagement. Like in science classrooms, it's the adult teaching children, right? But in a lot of public engagement, we have people across age ranges, we have people across different kinds of expertise, and how that is all brought together to matter in really powerful ways can make a big difference in whether somebody's feeling included or excluded in a public engagement activity. Another way to think about it is, in what ways are youth positioned as experts, in your public engagement activities? In one of the projects that I've run, youth came up with the term of community science expert. And it was their term to talk about their specific positioning. They were experts on science from being in the after school STEM program. They were experts on their community from having grown up there. And they were the only people who they felt could put these ideas together. They said, you could be so much smarter on science than us, but if you don't know our community, you won't know how to solve the problems the way we do. And so really just thinking about the different kinds of roles, the different kinds of ways that people can engage, all can kind of open up these norms for participating in science.
I wanted to touch on this intergenerational idea real quick, because it reminded me of a couple of times that I've seen at some of our neighborhood events, to where you'll see the kids run up to the table, they love it, they're just ready to go nuts over the activities. And the parents will sometimes stand off, they'll smile, they'll watch what's going on, but then the kids will bring them in, and then the parents love it as much as the kids do. And it's really just profound to see the sort of back and forth with them, and them still continuing to talk about it as you see them walk around the event later on. And it just seems a lot more impactful whenever the parents saw how cool it was, or learned something, or asked questions to the kid, the child answered the questions, all that sort of stuff. It seems to be a much better way to sort of bring it all together, or at least, a complementary way to bring it all together.
Yeah, I completely agree. One thing I really like about running these maybe intergenerational community groups where maybe children come along, and maybe children might even be the focus, but they'll be accompanied by parents and caregivers, is that you are able to reach people that might not normally engage with your STEM outreach, right? So if you're running an event for adults, for example, you're going to get a self-selecting sample, right? You're going to get adults coming along because they want to engage with STEM. If you run an event maybe to focus the children, you can often reach their parents as well. And they are not necessarily people that would otherwise engage with your STEM program. And you can both through the material that you actually do at the event, but then you can also spark these conversations, right? You can spark an interest in the children, and then the children will then talk to their parents, they'll talk to other members of the community. Like it's a really nice way to break out of this self-selecting mode, right? Where only people that are already keen come to your events.
Wonderful. Well, I think we're going to pause here, and I'm going to hand it back over to Brooke for some final thoughts. But thank you, Rick, Matt, and Angela for a fantastic discussion, and to our audience members for hanging out with us and asking some questions. It was awesome. So Brooke, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Jeannie. Don't go too far away because I have a couple questions for you to share some things.
Sure.
Thank you, all of you, for this really rich conversation, and thank you everyone that's been here and commenting. A few housekeeping things that I wanted to share. First of all, a number of you may have seen or filled out, and if you did, thank you, a survey that we administered this past summer, asking about things you would be interested in learning about if you had access to a communications and an engagement training or professional development workshop. We actually received quite a bit of response from that, which has been really exciting. And so I wanted to let you all know that the foundation is reflecting on what we heard from all of you, what you want, talking with experts who study science communication engagement and trainers who execute some of these programs to think about what we could design that would be most useful to the things you've asked for. So we're looking to launch that in 2022. It takes a little time to pull this together, but in 2022, we will be offering virtual communication and engagement professional development opportunities for Kavli Institute folks. And actually, one of the things we heard from many of you is the skills and competencies that we've talked about here is something you're interested in developing more. And so it just really struck me in listening to this conversation how we've heard from so many of you, like, help us figure out how to do this better, to be more culturally competent and areas like that. So we'll be looking for ways to build that in, which we are very excited about. Jeannie, can you say a word about the survey and our next webinar and discussion that's
Absolutely.
in the works? Thank you.
Yes. Sure. Thank you for that. So please, I think we're going to be dropping into the chat a link to our survey around getting feedback from you regarding how this went for you, what you want to hear from us in the future. And I am really excited. Speaking of the future, we do have our second webinar in the Science Society series scheduled for November 2nd. And we're going to have an awesome panel of people who are going to discuss leveraging your campus for science engagement. And so we are going to, or really mobilizing scientific communities and resources for science engagement. And so this is how the people are going to talk about how they've been able to get people to volunteer for their programs. As you know, a lot of the work that we do in engagement requires, I would be nowhere if I didn't have the volunteerism from our campus community and the Tri-I community, which also involves not just Rockefeller, but Memorial Sloan Kettering and Weill Cornell. And so we build on the shoulders of volunteerism and engagement work, and sometimes it's really hard. And I think Matt talked a little bit about like making the barrier to entry really low, but we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what that's all about in our next webinar series on November 2nd. So I'm really excited about that.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. And I also just want to acknowledge, in addition to thanking the great panelists and Jeannie here, yay, thank you. You've seen in the chat, Lauren Budenholzer has been putting in information. She's the public engagement specialist at the foundation, and Melina Fuentes, who's our administrative specialist, and Elaine Bowie, who's our meetings and events manager. The three of them have been instrumental in helping make today happen and helping make future ones happen. So thank you, Lauren, Melina, and Elaine, who we don't see on the screen, but we know you're working hard to make this all possible. So we look
And
forward
Brooke,
to more. Yeah, go ahead, Jeannie.
yeah, where can people find the recording when this webinar is finished and polished?
Yeah, we'll there'll be a link, but the Kavli community page that you this information's at, and if you haven't signed up for the Kavli community updates, you can do so, where you'll get emails about future webinars and other webinars and discussions that's happening that Kavli's supporting from our science team and other topics as well. Lauren just put the link in the chat. Yeah, and be in touch. Please fill out that survey. It'll be really fast, and we really want your ideas of future topics. If you want to have discussion groups in addition to these types of things, so we can design things that work for you. So thanks for taking that time.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
It's been
everybody.
a pleasure. Bye.